And thank you and welcome so much to everybody for signing up to what promises to be an absolutely scintillating conversation with our guest, the Reverend Shawn Sanford Beck, who you can see on your screen. I'll just run through the structure of the session before we start. We've allowed ourselves about 75 minutes to give ourselves a little bit of space. And to begin with, we'll do some welcome and also some land acknowledgements, because we're in different places and we're speaking about the spirits of the land today, so that seems important. Then we'll go through the main conversation with Shawn for about 45 minutes or so, and I'll give him some stimulus things to talk about. And then towards the end, depending on how things go, we will have some time for some Q&A, which we will do via the chat. So please do make full use of the chat just now throughout the session. Put your thoughts and comments in there. And we have Sarah and Diane on the call who will be monitoring that and putting themes together so that we try and cover people's questions at the end. And then at the end, we'll finish with a blessing from Shawn. So there we go. So let's get going. Welcome again to this conversation with Shawn Sanford Beck, which is a part of our series that we call Changing Our Minds. And in a nutshell, we think that's a collaborative exploration of wisdom and action that might help humanity move into a new era of mutual flourishing for all species on the Earth. An era that we might call ecozoic in both geological and theological language. My name is Deborah Colvin. I'm part of the Earth Justice team at St James's Church in Piccadilly in London, and my background includes farming, science, and education. The other members of the team are Sarah Mark, who is an artist and placemaker, and Diane Pacitti, who is a poet, and we've been working together for some years now on several projects. Both of them are on the call today, as I mentioned. So before we begin completely, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you today from the traditional lands of the Wadawurrung people in the present city of Geelong in Victoria, Australia. I'd like to pay my respects to the Wadawurrung elders, past, present, and emerging, and want to thank them for their care of country, both in the past and now, and for continuing their culture on this sacred land. I personally spent the first 18 years of my life on Wadawurrung country and know that my being is patterned by this place. Many people watching this conversation will be in the British Isles. We acknowledge the long history of this land now called Britain and all of the beings within it. We know that humans have lived on this land for at least 35,000 years, and for much of this time, the land was acknowledged as sacred, with ceremonies, songs, and ways of relating that made a living bond between land and people. And we also acknowledge our colonial and colonising heritage. So, Shawn Sanford Beck is an ecumenical Christian priest and the founder of the Ecumenical Companions of Sophia, an informal online community fostering Christian-Pagan dialogue and spiritual practice. He's the author of Christian Animism, where, in his own words, he searches out the fertile places of his own tradition, seeking to hear a word of healing for our earth, a word of grace for the trees and the animals, and a word of invitation back to the garden of creation, our once and future home. Most recently, he has co-published A Prairie Rune, described as equal parts spiritual meditation, collaborative interpretation, and poetic exposition. A really warm welcome to you, Shawn, and I wonder if you would like to offer a land acknowledgement as well.
Yeah, thanks so much, Deborah, and thanks everybody for welcoming me into your circle, into your space. And I beam into you today from Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, Canada, where it's approximately minus 37 degrees Celsius right now. But it is Meewasin, which is the Cree word for beautiful. So I am in the Meewasin Valley of Treaty 6 territory. Treaty 6 territory is the homeland of the Cree, the Saulteaux, the Nakota, Dakota, and Dene nations, among other First Nations, as well as being the heartland of the Métis people here in the prairies. And so as we speak together, I give thanks for the land here, for the lands from which you all beam in from, and in particular for the spirit of treaty which allows me to be where I am among the first peoples who are my neighbors here, and also among the more than human persons with whom I share this space. So really glad to be here with you this morning.
Thank you so much, Shawn, and that leads us beautifully into our first theme. You talk about the universe as animist, an animist universe teeming with persons, only some of whom are human. I wonder if you can tell us a little bit more about that.
Sure. So there's historically been a number of different definitions of animism. The word has a long history. I think when we first hear the word, we often think something about the spirit being everywhere, or sometimes we think about every living thing having its own spirit or its own soul. Sometimes, if we're trained from an anthropological background, we might think of that old definition of, inanimate things, so non-living things believed to have their own souls, and there's a whole bunch of sort of problematic pieces in that particular definition. But the most recent and most useful definition has come in the field of animist studies, and a person named Graham Harvey really came up with this phrase that many of us have really dug down into, about the animist as a person who lives in the world and experiences the world as teeming with persons, only some of whom are human. What that does is it expands our understanding, challenges and expands our understanding of personhood. So I think a lot of times people are more comfortable with the idea of, well, we're among many creatures, or we're among many beings even. But the animist pushes further and says, no, we are human persons among many, many more than human persons. And so it expands that category of personhood to animals, to plants, to ecosystems, to rivers, to weather patterns. It expands the notion of person well beyond just humans. And that sometimes, that means it gives our notions of consciousness and our notions of agency, of will, of personality, of communication and communicability well beyond the human. And so I think oftentimes, especially among indigenous peoples in different parts of the world, there's a sense of, you might hear it, and you heard it from what Deborah said in the introduction this morning too, the spirits. So when we're talking about the spirits, it's actually the persons, the more than human persons that are part of our neighborhoods.
And what kind of implications would that have for the way that we go about our lives?
Yeah. So a lot of people get into this through ecological and environmental commitments. We get into this once we start hearing our indigenous neighbors who are sharing those ecological environmental commitments, talking about the more than human persons or the other spirits. And what it does is it means that we can no longer, as humans, sort of imagine ourselves as the only things that matter in the universe, or the only things that really have spiritual significance in the universe. All of a sudden, we are one species among many. And not only species, we are one type of family member among a much bigger family. So it makes a difference, because now when we look at plants, the trees, the rivers, the waters, the mountains, the lands around us, we're no longer looking at resources. We're looking at relatives. And that actually makes all the difference. It doesn't give us an easy ethic. It doesn't give us all the ethical or social, political, or environmental answers right there, but it changes our fundamental notion of an imagination of how we interact with the rest of the world.
Yeah, yeah. And you mentioned how much of this comes from indigenous worldviews. And one outworking of that becomes the rights agenda. Rivers having rights, ecosystems, bioregions having rights.
Yep. Yeah, and that started in the legal language of redefining personhood. Ironically, that legal rights framework started back with the notion of corporations, right? That corporations, back in its old term, even before modern corporations, but corporations as more than just individuals, but larger bodies having personhood in the eyes of the law. That's really problematic for in terms of global justice, economic justice issues. But environmental lawyers were able to actually take the momentum of that notion of expanded personhood and begin to say, well, what does that mean if we apply personhood to a river, to a watershed, to a forest? What does it mean to give a mountain legal personhood and legal standing under the law? So yeah, there's some really creative things that have been done both here on Turtle Island and in Europe and various parts of the world in terms of advancing law along those lines of ecological person. At
increasingly at national level.
Definitely.
Yeah. So the other dimension of you and your life, Shawn, is your Christian commitment. So your approach is Christian animism.
Right.
I wonder if you could say a bit about that.
Sure, because I mean, historically, Christianity and animism as a worldview or even as a religious practice have been pitted against each other. And so when people first hear this phrase, Christian animism, it's sort of often folks just do a double take, like how could you have those two different worldviews come together? There's actually now, very happy to say, a whole international network called the Christian Animism Network. So there's people all over the place who are exploring how these two historically separate ways of being have re-come together. I wrote a book a while ago called Christian Animism, and I always answer this question of what is Christian Animism, simply by reading just a tiny bit of the introduction, just to give you a sense of where I'm coming from. So we've already talked about animism as a worldview that sees the universe teeming with persons, only some of whom are human. Christian animism, reading from my book, is simply what happens when a committed Christian engages the world and each creature as alive, sentient, and related, rather than soulless and ontologically inferior. However, that's not really simple, is it? This type of stance vis-a-vis the natural world would have enormous implications for all aspects of Christian belief and practice. What would liturgy look like, for instance, if we knew that plants, animals, and whole ecosystems were co-worshippers with us? How would our eschatologies change if we had to make room in heaven for the entire created order? Would our ethical processes morph if love your neighbor now included cows, plankton, and all manner of creepy crawlies? And what does pastoral care look like for trees, anyways? All of these and more are questions with which a Christian animist perspective must engage. So that's a little bit of sort of how I define. It's not really a definition. It's more of a sense of, if you're a Christian and if you've adopted an animist worldview, it doesn't necessarily change your view of God or even your sense of the basic tenets of Christian faith. It's opened you up to a whole different cosmology rather than a different theology necessarily. Although our theologies tend to change too once we become more cosmic and universal in our thinking. But so bringing those two pieces together, all of a sudden the category of neighbor, which is so important for Christianity, right? Jesus' whole ethic around love of neighbor, now includes all of these other more than human persons. And what do we do with
Yeah. Yeah. Huge questions.
them? Yeah,
So I've got at least two directions I'm going with that. So
yeah,
one is um, the roots of this kind of theologizing, cosmologizing within Christianity itself, rather than as opposed to individual Christians coming to that
right.
kind of commitment. I wonder if, and then the next bit is the idea of a cosmology. You've written, I think, in the same book that we lack a functional
Mhm.
cosmology.
Right.
We in our highly westernized societies. I wonder if you'd like to kind of follow either or both of those.
Sure. And those two questions are so deeply related. So I'll actually take the second one first. That's where we start from. So, sort of as modern Western post Enlightenment people. Now, however you want to fit into that category, if some of us fit into that category more than others, but just a general sort of dominant mainline Western view, our cosmology, our understanding of how the world actually works, is dominated by the language of scientific reductionism, a materialism. So even if we're very faithful believers, usually that means if there's a supernaturalism, it means we believe we make room in a materialist universe for God and the human soul as exceptions to material reality. We might, if we're maybe more of a charismatic type of believer, we might make room for angels, maybe demons. Beyond that, there's not much room for anything supernatural or anything spiritual. Everything else is pretty much set out and dominated by our understanding of a very mechanical, a mechanistic and reductionist view of how the world actually works. That wasn't always the case, but it's so dominant now for most of us that it's hard to even imagine other worldviews that don't operate from those notions, that have a very different starting point. And so for many of us, it's encountering either other religions or other cultures that don't have that mechanistic, scientific, reductionist worldview that starts us thinking and starts us imagining other ways. However, when we look at the history of Christian thought, we soon realize that this notion of a mechanical type of universe is only been around for a few hundred years. You only have to go back into the early modern period and previous to that into medieval forms of culture, Western culture, and before that into late antiquity, and before that into Iron Age cultures. And you recognize that we used to experience the world as a living organism, as spirit breathed, spirit infused, where the whole landscape was in some ways sort of haunted by the divine and other spiritual presences, where notions of very mechanistic laws of nature didn't hold. That wasn't really the way people experienced it. So when I look at for some of the roots of Christian animism, I go back to the Celtic saints that had hagiography that comes out of those stories. I look at the Franciscan tradition is a good example of more of an animistic way of viewing the world. Hildegard von Bingen is another figure who is really important to as a resource for understanding a more of a Christian animist view of the world. Many figures that are lost to us and hidden. So, for instance, even by the early modern period, where there was the time of the Reformation, there was a whole body of folks who were some people call it the Rosicrucian Reformation that went along with it, but it was deeply Christian, but it was still interested in the notion of the universe as a living being. And this came out of the Renaissance that was happening both in sort of the Southern Renaissance and the Northern Renaissance. But this idea that spirits and spirit were everywhere, not just somewhere in the human soul and somewhere in a heaven beyond space and time, but rather diffuse throughout the whole. So that's a long-winded answer to those two parts. Where we are now and where we mainly sort of came from.
Yeah, yeah, it's a lot to think about. In your book, you talk about very helpfully how Walter Wink kind of sets out that progress of worldviews, and would certainly recommend that to people who are on the call. Maybe while people digest that a little bit, Shawn, can you tell us a little bit about your personal journey, how you have come to this place, and what your experience is?
I think in some ways the seeds of this path have always been with me. I grew up not as a farmer, but in the country on an acreage. So I grew up spending lots of time sort of out in the bush and by the sloughs, and my nearest human neighbors were quite a ways away. So spare time for me was out in nature. And the seeds of this, I think, this animist perspective were planted then. Big influence for me has been ongoing, sometimes occasional, sometimes conflict-ridden because of the nature of colonialism in Canada. So sometimes very uncomfortable conversations with Indigenous folks, both who are Indigenous and Christian, and Indigenous and traditional. But folks who basically had a very different and continue to have a very different way of relating to the world, for whom I realized I needed a language. I needed to get in touch with a language that worked for me, that could be in honorable dialogue with folks who are Indigenous, my Indigenous neighbors. So that's been a big part of my own coming to embrace and articulate a Christian animist worldview. And then also I was able to had the privilege with my family to live off grid. We're back in the city now, but for about 7 or 8 years, we lived almost fully off grid, just north of the Battlefords in Saskatchewan, where no running water, very little electricity, apart from a bit of solar panel electricity, where we grew probably 90+% of our own food, where we in some ways lived as close to the ancestors as one can hope to these days. So that was really heavily important for forming, for really trying to figure out how to embody and practice an animist way of looking at the world and experiencing the world.
And through those -30-degree winters.
Yes, that's right. That's right. Where you realize that it's not all, it's not as it can sometimes be romanticized. That sometimes, you're, but to give a really good example of that, when I first had to start cutting down some of the trees so that we would have firewood, I felt very badly about it, because here I am, an animist, and I'm taking an axe to the trees, and so I had to really. And ended up talking to the trees a lot and communicating with them and saying, please, it was this real sense of humility. Please, I need to do this because my family's going to die if I don't. Will you lend me your life? Interestingly enough, found out scientifically later that for poplar, especially because our main trees are poplar there, they of course are cloned, so they all come from one root. So they do sort of drop down in the winter. They go into hibernation in the winter, and by taking some, it's more like giving a haircut than actually destroying beings. The individual person of poplar is actually the whole grove rather than individual trees. But at the time, I didn't know that, and I just knew I was potentially.
It says something about our approach and our consciousness as individual humans, doesn't it? That
it does.
Maybe it's not about going out there and begging. Maybe it's about living holistically with everything that's there, which is that leads into what I was going to ask you about. What is our role as humans? So there is a whole spectrum of the way the way we think about ourselves, aren't they? That we're in control, we have dominion over, that at the other end of the spectrum, some people are saying the Earth's going to be better off without us. What is our role? We are undeniably special, I would say. But in what way? What does that mean?
I mean, I think that's one of our key questions these days. And it's a question of imagination. Who do we imagine ourselves to be? And for so long, we have imagined ourselves to be the masters, having dominion. You know, that very faulty but very prevalent view of that reading of Genesis that says humans are to have dominion and to subdue the entire earth. And so we built most of our culture around that, and certainly our modes of production and industry around that. So that's one imagination of it. Like you said, on the other end of the spectrum, and I empathize with this, you've got a deep green perspective that says humans are really only just one species among many, and quite frankly, the earth would be better off without us, that we've become a cancer on the face of the earth, and the sooner we do ourselves in, the better. And, you know, I mean, I can empathize with that point of view, but I don't go there. I think there's got to be another way forward. So a lot of Christians have, I think, helpfully adopted the notion of stewardship in some ways. I think that's a step forward beyond or a step away from dominion theology. But the fact is, stewards are still sort of in control. Stewards still make economic and managerial decisions about wise use, about how we still use natural resources, which is different than relations, than seeing the rest of the world as relatives to us. So I really wrestled with this a lot. I think for me, where I've come to is, how do we imagine ourselves actually as priests, pastors, or what some people really resonate with the word chaplains to creation? What would it mean for us to imagine ourselves primarily here, not to be users of the rest of creation, but actually as those who pray for, who take care of, who minister to, who worship with, who bless the rest of our relatives? That's become a fruitful way for me and also for others to start to think about who is the human? What are humans for? What are we all about here in creation?
Yeah, I was speaking with an Aboriginal elder earlier this week, as it happens, and she's wrestled with this, and her kind of current wisdom is that the earth is lonely without us. So we've come to this place, we've abandoned in some way, or not all of us, obviously, but many of us have abandoned, and the earth is lonely without us, which I found really moving.
I hear that from other elders in Turtle Island too, both having heard verbally and also read some of their words. This notion that humans are pretty useless, except to the rest of creation, except that we can sing and dance and pray for the rest of the world. Yes, I just a note about Robin Wall Kimmerer. Actually, she's been somebody who's really mentioned that humans do have a role, but it involves our songs and dances.
Yeah, there's a transformation, isn't it? Not resource extraction and growth, but ceremony, song, and dance. What a turnaround!
Yep. Exactly. Yep.
Can I ask you another pair then, Shawn, which is about how do we communicate? You know, it's not as we are talking now. What is the mode in which we communicate with these teeming spirits and persons? And then the second bit, which I think is also coming through the chat, is about cities. There are 9 billion of us, give or take a few. The vast majority are in cities. We're not all going to go off grid. How do we do it?
Good question. Okay, let me just address the city piece just real quick. I mean, I think there are some there are some real issues around population, and I know it can be very controversial to even suggest that, because usually what that means is Northwesterners going, well, look at the global South. There's way too many folks, and so it quickly becomes this very sort of racist way of looking at world population, which is highly problematic. That's not to say that there isn't an issue around population and looking at the real limits of the natural world and how humans can continue to find a place within that. So cities are the places where we most need to reckon with that. I think that part of our temptation is to say there's going to be a magic bullet. There's going to be one way we can deal with this, and as soon as we figure that out, then boom, we can transform all of our cities into livable spaces. I don't think that's realistic. I think we need to pay attention to where there are small but successful experiments in new ways of being, in sustainable ways of being within cities. Because you are right, not all of us can go off grid, can go back to the land. We would just use up everything right off the bat. So we've got to figure out how to live in cities. I think there are going to be as many different I won't say solutions, but movements forward in that as there are cities, as there are cultures. There will be what's appropriate technology and appropriate living ways of living emerging, in all different parts of the globe, and it's all going to look differently. But I do think the question is prevalent, because you're right. If we can't figure out how our cities can be sustainable, then there may be a bit of there will be a reckoning.
Plurality.
Total plurality, and we don't like that. At least the Western mindset is very much one of, let's figure out the magic bullet. Let's find what works in one place, and it must then be able to be replicated everywhere, because that's sort of the scientific method. That's not really the way it works, though. I don't think so. I think prior to finding solutions, though, it is around the transformation of our imagination. So I was really appreciative of the subtitle of this whole series, Changing Our Minds. Part of that is rational. There has to be a rational grappling with things. But part of it is actually the transformation of our imaginations, because so much of this stuff starts that we can't, our imaginations are shaped so much by the dominant model that we can't find solutions or inspirations beyond that. So what does it take to transform our imaginations? And it's that looking at the imagination that actually goes to answer the first question about how do we communicate with all the other more than human persons. I actually think there are many ways, but I think for many of us, and the way that I have found that sort of works the best is actually one that uses the active imagination. We're not used to doing this, because even though many of us, when we were children, saw spirits, played with fairies, knew that there were things in the bush that were, scary or interesting or enchanting, by the time we hit, junior high or whatever, that's been sort of beaten out of us in some ways, mentally, in terms of you got to leave those childish ways behind. And so we hear phrases like, oh, well, it's just in your imagination, as if imagination is a flawed tool for perceiving reality. So I have this mode of communication. It's a tool, it's a spiritual practice called tithing. And if anybody wants to take a look into this, I would highly recommend Google tithing. It's Kything, not tithing. You can do that too. That's good spiritual practice, but tithing. And this comes from a concept that was made popular by Madeleine L'Engle in her Wrinkle in Time series. It was a word that she coined but then became sort of a spiritual technology for other people afterwards. And Madeline L'Engle was quite thrilled that people actually took her idea and ran with it. But tithing is a way of practicing a spirit to spirit communion and sometimes communication with other persons, whether those are human persons, plant persons, tree persons, animal persons, angelic persons. One of the key tithers is a cherubim in the stories, the person of God. Tithing with those more than human persons through the active imagination. And so that's a really powerful practice that I would commend to folks. The very easy way of trying this is, in fact, it's so easy that once you do it, I can almost guarantee that afterwards you will say, oh, that was really neat, but I'm sure that was just my imagination. But it's actually using your imagination. You pick another more than human person. It might be your animal companion. It might be a house plant. It might be a tree on your block or in your backyard. Sitting with it, just centering yourself, breathing, and then holding that being in your mind, in the eye of your mind, and imagining them opening their eyes, having a mouth, and beginning to converse with them. In some ways, it's very, very childish. It's something that, or childlike, I should say. It's something that many of us did as kids. It is totally anthropomorphic. It's deliberately anthropomorphic because what that does is it allows the other to have a voice that we can understand. What's really happening there is our spirits or our hearts or our energy fields, however you want to understand that, are always communicating information to each other. Using the active imagination allows us to tap into that in a conscious way rather than an unconscious way. So oftentimes, unless you're indigenous and you're part of a living culture that has tools and techniques to hear the voices of the spirits, this is another way to give it a try. And I would just encourage people to try it and to let yourself feel a little bit silly about it to begin with. But just go with it and see what happens when you begin to engage with other more than human persons in that way.
Yeah, so we honor active imagination in so many other parts of our life, not least the arts. That why would we kind of disengage from it at that level?
Yeah.
I want to maybe just one more piece, Shawn, before we open up the floor. Which might be about for those of us who are involved in organized religion. What does all this mean for our liturgy and our engagement? If for example there are teeming hordes of non-human parishioners whom we often say at St. James's that we are simply joining in the worship of the whole of creation. Anyway, what can we do with our liturgies?
Well, I mean, I think what you've said about what St. James's does even to acknowledge that to begin with is amazing. And it takes you so much further than many congregations have gone so far. Even just to name the fact that there are many more neighbors that are there with you in spirit, that are not just human companions, but more than human companions. That goes a long way. I think there are specific areas within the liturgy where we could even further do this. Thinking about the Sanctus within the Eucharist, where we are acknowledging that we are in the presence of angels and archangels and saints and Mary, and how much of a stretch would it be to simply name some of the other beings that are also within that Sanctus? So that's a possibility. I've noticed there's a lot of people a lot of congregations now that are starting within the prayers of the people, within the intercessions, to begin to pray for the rest of the earth, whether that's their locality, or whether that's the fires that they've heard about and the ecological disasters they've heard about in other parts of the world, but to extend prayers beyond just the human, I think that's really important. And also, there are a whole number of what are now called paraliturgical, but they used to be part of the church's liturgy in the medieval and even in the early Reformation times, that actually go ceremony that goes outside the church building. So whether that's beating the bounds, whether that's rogation Sundays, whether that is the blessing of the plow, there are a whole bunch of different ceremonies that have been part of the Christian tradition in the past that can be reclaimed. It's more than about just using the same words and doing it the exact same way, but that can be reclaimed in a way that acknowledges the presence of the more than human persons all around us, the more than human parishioners all around us. So I think there are some things that the church is already starting to do. I take great heart from the Forest Church movement, from the Mossy Church movement, not just Messy Church, Mossy Church movement that sometimes goes with that. I think sometimes we fall into trouble because sometimes people imagine that just means taking what we usually do in church and doing it outside and not actually framing it within a different cosmology too. But I think it's a good step forward, and I'm excited about that. Wild Church here in Turtle Island, that's another part of the movement that where people can deliberately encounter not only God, because we've got a long tradition of encountering God outside. I mean, that's not our problem, but actually encountering the more than human persons, all of the other spirits along with God outside.
Yeah. Encounter. There's a key, I think you say in your book, about an encounter and meaning. Perhaps we need to focus a whole lot more on encounter rather than our internal works. Shawn, that's fantastic. I'm thinking I'm going to just take us out of focus mode now so that everybody will be on the screen. Maybe just take a minute, everybody, to perhaps look at the chat, add anything to the chat that you would like to, and we'll have a scroll through. So I'm stopping the focus mode. And in the chat, let's have a look. So what do you fancy in here, Shawn?
Oh my goodness, there is so much going on in the chat here.
There's a lot of rich stuff here. I'm just scrolling up a little bit to close it out. How about this from Penelope? So thinking about praxis and liturgy, as well as all the ologies, and given we're not that good at really relating to our own species, particularly those who don't look like us, can you help us develop relationship with our more than human neighbors? So I think maybe that's the next step on from the imaginal communication.
Right. So I mean, there's lots of different people trying different experiments in this. And I totally appreciate the notion. This is not even easy to do with other humans who look different than us. We don't get this right. I mean, I think that's part of where, if we have any sense of what sin might be, is that we're very curved in on ourselves and in on our own experience and quite xenophobic in many different ways about not being able to recognize the image of God in even the human other, let alone the more than human other. But here's something that I do suggest to people to try sometimes: to begin to think about yourself as a priest, a priestess, a minister, a chaplain, whatever word works for you of that spiritual person. And find your own parish. Like what piece of geography do you encounter on a regular basis? Maybe it's a walk through a particular park. Maybe it's maybe when you go to work, you go outside and you eat your sandwich in a little green space. Maybe you're somebody who you're confined to your apartment in inner city London, and all you've got is a plant of herbs, a plant of rosemary out on your balcony, or even in your kitchen window. But find whatever space it is for you that's a real space where you can encounter a more than human person, or a set of more than human persons. And every day, think of yourself as those beings minister. What do ministers do? They take time to listen. They first try not to do harm, although we know that happens. They try to do no harm. They listen. They pray for, right? So you can pray for the trees, the waters, your herbs, your cat, your dog. Pray for your parishioners, just like your priest or minister or chaplain prays for you. And they bless. Every day they bless. And so that is, I think, a very concrete way. And again, is it pretending? Yeah, it is. Like, pretend to be their ministers until you find that you are their minister, and see what happens inside. See what happens as your imagination starts to shift and you begin to understand yourself in a very different type of relationship with your parish, with your parishioners, with these more than human persons. So that's a way to start with that. I love that question. Can being a priest go both ways? Yes. And that is the thing that people find once they start doing this, that they are being priested by the more than human persons around them as much as the other way around. So yeah, for sure.
Yeah, amazing. I like these philosophical questions here about there is a worldview of reductionist science that we could say we've been captured by. But what about the whole world of contemporary science, of quantum physics and the rest, that where the nature of consciousness is being completely redefined? Is it even internal consciousness? Is consciousness something that we participate in rather than being something located inside us? And in that kind of critique, what would the change look like if we started to live like that?
Yeah, exactly. So I think that the popular understandings of science that have informed, when I talk about the domination of the reductionist worldview, it's actually outmoded ways of scientific thinking that have just been part of the industrial, scientific industrial. Oops, is anybody up hearing that echo?
Got an echo there, yeah.
Sorry, I'm going to try to do something here. Just stop.
Yes, actually, I think that's okay now, Shawn.
There we go. Okay.
Brilliant.
So actual science, actual new science, whether that's in quantum physics, whether that's in the disciplines of evolving disciplines of ecology, consciousness studies, that's cutting edge stuff. And that's so far beyond what we usually think about what has formed us that, I think that's where there's a wonderful engagement between, real science and real spirituality that is going to lead us into some amazing directions.
Yeah. And not to divert too much, but it's been around a long time, different approaches to science. Science is not monolithic. We need to think about indigenous sciences and medieval sciences, which approach things science is really basically about knowing, isn't it? So how we observe and how we know. This field is wide open. We've got the priests going here. Here's an interesting one. How do we find comfort in the heartbreak of what is happening in the suffering of other persons? We could be overwhelmed, could we not?
It's very easy to feel overwhelmed, and I know for those of us who have been in the ecological activist community for a while, it can really you can end up running up against this sense of either nothing matters and so I'm just going to drop out of this, or you can end up, actually wrestling with like clinical forms of depression from out of this. It can also turn into tendencies toward violence, i.e., if we can't fix it, let's burn it down. There are all of those things that are really come out of deep, 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 deep grief. And there's no silver bullet. Again, there's no one solution that solves all that. I have found, though, that when we see ourselves as one set of persons, human set of persons, among many other persons who have their own agency, their own power, their own ways of resisting global capitalism and industrialism, that actually it's easier to feel like just an ally rather than a savior. I mean, part of humanity's problem is sometimes we've flipped from the dominion model into the, well, we've got to save it all model, and that's not helpful. But if the rest of the creation is actually working towards its own healing, then we're just one part of this great big song, this great big movement of resistance and healing that that is going on all around us as well as within us. So for me, that does give some sense of comfort that we're not alone in this.
Mm, mm. And what about the future? Artificial intelligence. Will they have souls?
That's an interesting one. All I can give you is my opinion. I grew up on Star Wars, so R2-D2 and C-3PO are obviously real people. So I'm prejudiced, I'm biased, but in a real sense, it comes to the question of what is consciousness. Are we, when we, as animists, when we start to recognize consciousness happens in many different forms, not only human forms, but actually that the whole universe is suffused with consciousness, it changes the tone behind the AI question. It opens up the possibility in ways that, again, if we're only operating with a sense of human consciousness, it's not really there.
Yeah, amazing. And related to that for me is about resistance. And so resistance is the model we're in, but how does resistance become active in this multifarious universe?
Yeah.
Oh.
I love the scene in within Lord of the Rings when Merry and Pippin encounter Treebeard for the first time, right? And they begin to interact with this Ent who talks about, the language of the Ents being so slow. And there's something about that that's really important, that we humans operate very fast. Like if we can't fix this now, we begin to despair. But I think the more than human persons teach us something about longer term perspectives in resistance and healing and transformation. I know a lot of Indigenous elders where I'm from talk about the rocks, the stone people who they speak very slowly, but they've seen so much, it helps us change our own sort of instantaneous perspectives.
Yeah, amazing.
I love the fact, I've got to say, I love the fact, just looking at these questions, that so many folks here in this Zoom stream have obviously done so much thinking about all of this stuff already. I mean, I talk a lot. I'd love to hear what other people are thinking, because I know each of you are on your own journeys with this, and lots of wisdom gathered here. So,
absolutely. Are there any other particular questions you'd like to respond to, Shawn?
All of them, but we probably don't have time. I do I appreciate that one. How does this impact how we think about treating infections, bacteria or viruses? I mean, I think that goes to a larger question about not the importance of not romanticizing the universe and not romanticizing the more than human world, that it's not all sort of unicorns and rainbows, so to speak, that this is another thing that I've really learned, again, from Indigenous folks, is life feeds on life. The Cree, there's a sort of a joke that the Cree word for vegetarian means simply bad hunter.
Yeah.
Now, I say that I used to be a vegetarian, and I have all the time in the world for vegetarian and vegan perspectives. Huge respect for that. I've noticed a lot of Indigenous animist communities, though, are not vegetarian, but there is this sense that life eats life, and it's more a matter of respect in how that happens. So we know not just what we're eating, but who we're eating. And I think that goes to like recognizing that bacteria and viruses have just as much a place in this world as we do, and do have their own forms of sentience and agency, and that sometimes learning how to coexist together, just having come through, if we are through COVID, sometimes the language around that is battle. Maybe the language around it needs to be more about dance, and I say that knowing that many humans have died in that dance, but how do we not just treat it as a big battle all the time?
Yeah. And ecologically, the primary relationship between beings is eating.
Yeah. Eating and loving.
Absolutely.
I want to say eating and loving. Yeah.
Well done. Maybe that's the two things we need.
I like what somebody just said there. In all our culture, bad hunter might mean eating factory farm. Yeah. I mean, that is bad hunting too. And as soon as we begin to imagine those pigs in the cages and the chickens confined to that, and the horrors, the absolute horrors of industrial agriculture, as soon as we start to recognize those folks as our relatives, it changes everything.
But there's a planetary economics to that as well, isn't it? That there simply isn't enough energy and wealth for everybody to eat like that.
Yeah, exactly.
Fantastic. Well, I wonder if now is a good moment to draw this together. Huge food for thought, huge possibility for us all to go away and develop our relationships, and to become animist, perhaps even more. Shawn, would you like to conclude with a blessing for us?
Why don't we do that? And before I do, I just once again want to say thank you to the Ecozoic team, and to St. James, and to all of you who have gathered to take part in this conversation. It warms my heart, because I know that these ways of being and these conversations are spreading across the world, and it is changing things. So I just really appreciate that. But as we draw to a close, I just invite you to take a few moments, maybe roll your shoulders, change your posture a little bit, to close your eyes if that's comfortable for you, or to keep them open if you would rather. But wherever you are, to feel your feet planted on the earth. Might be on the floor, perhaps the earth is down a few floors, or down through a sub-basement and basement, but somewhere down there is the living holy ground of Mother Earth. And so just feel her through the soles of your feet as you breathe, and as we breathe together. And as you breathe deeply, know that you are a tree, and that your roots go down into the earth, down through the clay, down through the gravel, down into the rocks, the bones of the mother. You are rooted in holy ground. And now imagine that from your head and from your shoulders and your arms, branches are sprouting. They are sprouting forth and reaching up, reaching towards the sky, drawing down to you the light of the sun, the moon, the stars, the planets in their courses. And that in your trunk, in your heart, the energy of the earth meets the energy of the heavens. We remember that God is love and her body is all creation. She is a tree of life who gathers her children in love. And as we go forth from this place, may God bless us and keep us. God's face shine on us and be gracious to us. God look upon us with favor and grant us peace, us and all the teeming persons around us, our neighbors, this day and always, world without end. Amen.
Amen. Shawn, thank you so much. Every blessing from all of us, I'm sure.
Thank you.
And may the conversations continue with all of the persons. And thank you, everybody, for coming. See you at the next one, second Sunday evening in February.